Good, okay. So welcome everyone. I think we'll make a start now. So I'm Kerry Brown, I'm the director of the Lau China Institute, and I'm very glad to welcome you today to the launch of our second paper in the Lau China Institute Policy Series. This year's series is entitled China in the World, and we're proud to be partnering with King's Security Studies on the series. And we're also delighted to have worked with Dr. Mark Hilborne, lead for the Space Security Research Group at King's on this second paper. The Lau China Institute exists for three purposes. One is to educate, so we run masters and doctoral students programs. The second is obviously to research, so we do research, multidisciplinary research in areas from mental health in China to the political economy, the history of China, politics in China. I have 6 colleagues at the moment who help with that. But the final part of our work is this very important function of outreach. And so if you're not signed up to our monthly newsletter, you'll be very welcome to sign up to that and receive news about what we're doing. And James will be putting the link to sign up to that in the chat now. You can also follow us on Twitter, Lau China Inst. Again, James will put that up on the chat. And if you wish to tweet throughout, Hannah will be sharing those using the hashtag, hashtag Lau Policy Series. So our author of this second paper, Dr. Mark Hilborne, is a lecturer in Defence Studies Department and War Studies Online, as well as the lead for the Space Security Research Group. And he'll be presenting the paper for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll have a panel, and I'll introduce the panel once Mark's finished speaking. And then after that, we'll be able to have a panel discussion and then Q&A. So if I would now like to invite Dr. Mark Hilborne to present his paper. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Kerry. Let me just go through the commotion of sharing and see. There. Does that look about right?
That looks great. Yeah, that looks good.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Brown, for the opportunity to contribute to this series of paper. I think it looks a really interesting project. As you said, this is the second, so there's many more to come. And I think, the timing of this paper is opportune, not only because there's this series, of course, but for a number of perspectives. There's a lot going on in space. And if we think of the UK and let's say the home audience, currently, the government is looking a lot more at space, focused on space for a number of key agenda points like prosperity and diplomacy and security. Also in the coming days, so we hear, maybe it might be coming weeks, but in the coming days, we'll see the latest Security and Defense Review, the integrated review, and that's expected to feature space to a much greater extent than we've seen previously in different forms of UK policy. And that should be followed in a not too distant future. Again, dates are a little hazy. We'll see the National Space Strategy and the Defence Space Strategy, which hopefully will present us then with a coherent picture of what the UK will be doing in space. It's also important to remember the recent sponsoring by the UK of a resolution in UN that was successfully adopted in November, looking at responsible behavior in space. Now this, I haven't presented policy options, particularly with this paper, but I think that's, a very fundamental way of looking at things, shaping space governance in the space environment as we go forward. So a very important step, but it also heralds efforts for the UK to gain a more central role in the governance of space and a sort of larger voice. But of course, events in space have been pretty significant and coming thick and fast. So the NASA mission, I think, has probably galvanized everybody's attention, but closer to the focus of this paper is China's program, which quite obviously is progressing very quickly, and we can see a number of recent successes. Not to give you a laundry list, I've probably done too much of that in the paper already, but we had the Chang'e 4, which is humankind's first landing on a dark side of the moon. Chang'e 5, bringing back lunar samples, first time since the 1970s. The somewhat murky test of a space plane in December. And we're also looking forward, probably next month, again, not quite sure, to the launch of the first module of China's next space station. So these are, incredible milestones by any measure, but these, they fit these into 2 years, so quite extraordinary, really. So I think this series of papers times it very well, looking, gives us an opportunity to think of the rise of China, what that might mean, and how it might affect strategic stability, in this case, space. And so in looking at this, I've looked at three components in the paper. The first of which is the space domain itself and its unique aspects and how that presents certain difficulties when we're thinking of strategic competition and power geometries, etc. The second, of course, is China's space program itself, but it's also the way it's unfolding and how it's characterized, sort of characterized by ambiguity. I think, opaque politics fused with things like dual-use technology, which is inherent in space, makes divining China's intentions very difficult. And the third component is the US, which as the preeminent sort of player or spacefaring nation in space, gains a lot of advantages, but it's, there's also an accompanying vulnerability there given the critical reliance on space capabilities and the inherent difficulty in defending these kind of assets. So we see kind of a combination of ambiguity and sensitivity, which is increased by the critical importance of space, and that vulnerability. And that creates a rather precarious balance and a lot of room for misperception. I think that's a key theme when we're thinking of the rise of China in space. And so I will illuminate these different factors individually and separately a little bit. Now, I don't really know the composition of who's out there today. So I think a few basics bear repeating just when we're thinking of the space environment and how the domain perhaps throws up certain issues and questions. And so particularly important is that access to space and space capabilities is critical really for all aspects of modern life. And that's not really recognized, I think, by the public or by policymakers generally. But denial of access to space would completely disrupt things like banking, stock markets, the internet, electricity grid, nuclear reactors, many forms of sort of earth and environmental monitoring, maybe most importantly television, but many other functions as well. Many of these rely on specifically what's called the PNT signal, the position, navigation, and timing signal that emanates from our global navigation and satellite systems. I put this up. This is an excellent report written by the British government in 2018, and it notes the kind of scale of dependence on position, navigation, and timing. It's profound, not fully recognized either by the operators of infrastructure or indeed by government. It's seen as a fundamental supporter of critical national infrastructure, but now space is also recognized as part of critical national infrastructure. But nonetheless, it's easily manipulated depending on the kind of signals we're talking about. And this is a particular example of Russia accused of manipulating the GPS signal in 2017, which resulted in a lot of ships being significantly off course in the Black Sea. So despite that reliance and what we might think is almost an intimate relationship with space, it's also very remote, and that creates in itself a lot of problems. There's a great difficulty in characterizing activity in space, and attribution is very difficult. So for instance, a satellite malfunction could be the result of space weather, like a solar flare, could be a technical defect, space debris, or hostile action. We really don't know quite often, depends on the situation. In addition to this, then the rules governing space are not particularly precise. And so there's a great deal of uncertainty about what is happening in space and what is allowed to happen in space. Space technology also gives militaries, a powerful set of capabilities, intelligence gathering, precision navigation and targeting, communications. But given the kind of advantages that provides, we're becoming increasingly dependent on space. These are becoming increasingly entrenched and therefore an issue of contestation. And it's a domain then that states will increasingly seek military advantage from and within. And a particular issue in space is not unique to space, but perhaps it's a much bigger issue in space, is that most platforms and most technologies have dual use potential. And that's true for the entire spectrum of space systems. We're thinking of launch, satellites themselves, ways of monitoring or tracking them, and even the data or the imagery that they create has dual use. And I used the example in the paper of synthetic aperture radar as one case in point. Excellent tools for a number of civilian or commercial purposes, but also for surveillance and identification of military targets. And satellites can have, be dual tasked, either simultaneously or they can move from one task to another. So that makes, again, understanding a military position rather difficult. There's a military aspect, but of course there's a non-military aspect, and the latter will impact the former. So developments in commercial space now are really driving the space sector. They're changing the complexion of the space environment, and that's going to affect military users as they respond to these different types of actors and different types of technology that they can then avail themselves to. And now, you know, there's a clear trajectory, I think, in US military, looking at, say, constellations of low Earth orbit small sats in relation to, say, large geostationary sats are becoming more of the former. So that means gaining a clear picture of how a potential opponent is configured in space and what intentions underpin those configurations is fraught with uncertainty. And so it's within that context then that China is accelerating its program. And of course, that's the major focus of this paper. As I noticed, you know, it's an ambitious program across the spectrum: military, scientific, civilian, commercial. And it leads to a number of sort of headlines, I suppose, in the papers of a space race. And I try to avoid that term because I think, you know, the more, I suppose, antagonistic you frame a competition, then it starts to close down some of your policy options. But nonetheless, if you look at Kevin's recent paper, you know, that unveils, I think, a strong element of competition in China. And so competition does exist, and it's just hard to specify what character that competition is. So China maintains that its ambitions in space are peaceful, and to that end, we saw them begin work on a treaty to prevent the weaponization of space in 2002 in the UN with Russia. And that resulted in what's called the PPWT in 2008, kind of updated version in 2014. Admirable in a number of respects, but of course, other actions undermine those credentials. So most notorious was the 2007 direct descent anti-satellite test, a kind of weapon system that the PPWT did not cover, but nonetheless, it sends mixed messages. And China didn't actually announce it was going to do that, and didn't even notify after the event. That had to be drawn out by the US when they recognized an exo-atmospheric test. Similarly, in 2013, there was an apparent high altitude test mission. An official sort of news outlet said this went to a height of about 10,000 kilometers. But in fact, tracking showed that it went to about 36,000 kilometers, which is the altitude of geostationary orbits. And it was then concluded that this was a technology test for a potential geostationary anti-satellite weapon, which would be significant because that is not something that anybody else has yet fielded. So those create very much mixed messages then. And another difficulty layered on top of that is the kind of opaque politics we see as characterizing China. So very difficult to gain a clear insight in how decisions are made. And given that uncertainty and the remoteness of space in combination, then it's very easy for states to make worst case assumptions. And it's this whole issue of misperceptions. So if we're considering kind of power balances, if you like, then a further point of uncertainty is the wider fusion that China has between military and civilian capabilities. Now that's not unique, but it's sort of centrally driven. A good illustration of this is the aptly named civil military fusion policy initiated in 2016 by President Xi, which is expansive and comprehensive with a central goal of driving innovation in the PRC both in the military and commercial spheres. And so to achieve this, the main partitions between China's civilian, commercial, and military research are made as transparent as possible. And that facilitates then coordination between scientific research institutions, universities, commercial enterprises, and the military in a number of high-tech areas, aerospace being one of them, but big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, these kind of things. And that's even extended down to the academic sphere. And this ties in with a recent King's webinar with Joe Johnson and a number of others about the influence of China in the UK academic sphere. But in China, about 61 universities are now supervised in some way, shape, or form by China's Defense Industry Agency. We also see that kind of fusion in the construction of infrastructure, both physical and informational, where military requirements are kind of enmeshed in these projects. And to my understanding, that's not just in China, but it's in some of the foreign construction efforts as well. And so, as might be imagined then, this creates inevitable concerns of growing military capabilities shrouded in wider technological and commercial progress. And when considering the space domain specifically, then policies such as MCF further reduces the kind of clarity we have on military capabilities, what is military and what is not. And so intent then becomes much harder to read. Now, the third component that I deal with in the paper is the United States. And of course, what's interesting is how the United States might react to the rise of China. And as you might imagine, given all the elements that I've just shown, and that the rise of China in space, its dynamic rise, if you like, generates a lot of sensitivities in the US. Now, I'm not trying to say for a minute that the US has some particular prerogative in space. But rising powers will need to be conscious that their actions have reactions, and that's true in every domain. But space, I think, sparks particular sensitivities in the US, partially because of its place in strategic culture and popular culture. It's a very important symbol of America's scientific prowess and global leadership. But also the extent of development and investment in the environment is far more than any other state, and as a result, its dependence on the space domain is much higher than any other state. So, while space offers the US extensive services and capabilities, and in particular, they provide the military with tremendous advantages, they are simultaneously virtually defenseless, and they create profound vulnerabilities. And I think that's then a distinction or a departure from other elements of military power. This kind of lack of, this defenselessness, I guess, is an inherent characteristic. Satellites have to be very light and thinly skinned in order to launch them. Now that's compounded by a number of aspects. We might call it the vulnerability gap and asymmetry and asymmetry in vulnerability, nuclear entanglement, and what we might call gray zone tactics. And I'll just briefly look at these because they are points, I think, of a particular issue in terms of driving those sensitivities as we see the rise of China. So the first then, the vulnerability gap, or that asymmetry in vulnerability, is really the juxtaposition of the advantages and the power that the US derives from space, combined with the liabilities and vulnerabilities. And so it's assumed then that gap, if you like, and that vulnerability creates a temptation in certain opponents for a preemptive strike, hoping to cause surprise, disarray, or maybe disproportionate advantage. It might also be calculated by those opponents that because it doesn't actually create an existential threat to the US, then there might be less risk of some kind of reprisal. So it's that vulnerability gap is seen as then providing a strong temptation for asymmetric and preemptive strike. That interlinks then with this issue of nuclear entanglement, and that stems from the use by the US of space assets for ballistic missile defense and stitched into its nuclear deterrent. And the problem here is the small number of satellites that are tasked with nuclear orders, but not just nuclear orders. So about 4 satellites oversee these kind of what we call nuclear orders or high priority non-nuclear users as well. And that can lead to an entanglement of nuclear and conventional space missions where, say, warfighting with near peers in space, if that was to happen for conventional purposes, could potentially threaten the nuclear mission. So those last 2 points are particularly less about China, more about the US, but nonetheless, China's rise in space creates particular sensitivities for those reasons. More broadly, I think applicable is this issue of gray zone tactics. And I think we're all familiar with sub-threshold activity that sits between kind of normal competition and what might be considered war. And as I mentioned at the beginning, what is permissible in space is quite vague. It's difficult to attribute any action in space to any particular cause, and that makes it fairly easy to act below the threshold, if you like, in space. We've seen it in the South China Sea, where China uses what we might call non-gray hulls, things like fishing flotillas, to enhance sovereignty claims, for instance. It's fairly easily done in space as well, and it's constant reports of dazzling and those kind of issues. So China and Russia have, it appears, conducted space operations that look a lot like these. So in 2014, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, had its satellite information, whether systems attacked. They were down for 2 days. I gave you the example already of the Russian GPS attack, and they did that in Crimea and in Syria currently too. So, and as a result, I think the ease of doing this is quite a likely form of activity in space. Things like dazzling, jamming, spoofing, or manipulating the satellites or manipulating their signals. Given that attribution is impossible, it's probably a kind of activity that we'll see a lot more of. So these dynamics, these characteristics of the space domain and the key spacefaring nations create then a great deal of potential for misperceptions. And the strategic dialogue that might dispel this has been slow in evolving, and we've seen now, is now in a bit of a hiatus, perhaps reflecting tensions elsewhere. But as I think further insight to China's thinking is gained, and I think we'll hear a bit more from Kevin on this, we begin to expose a highly competitive agenda where it seems that official statements look at China eclipsing the US as a major space power by mid-century. And China views the competition between itself and the US as reflecting their wider relationship. And as China seeks global power, space will be an important element of this course. So China will challenge in space and probably via space, buying political influence, et cetera, via this as well. So just as I note in the conclusions, the tensions that arise due to this competition trigger particular sensitivities, and we need careful management. I mentioned, as I say, it's not a policy paper, but I mentioned the recent UN resolution. We need to manage that very carefully before space becomes a domain of outright hostility. If we get this wrong, it would have catastrophic consequences really for our access to space, our utility of space. And it sounds a bit dreary, but we could quite easily entomb ourselves on Earth if we get it wrong. So I'll draw a line there. Like I say, well, I imagine somehow that the discussion will then look at what are our options and how do we manage this in space. But Kerry, that's all I have to say at the moment, and look forward to hearing from our panel members. I'll stop sharing now.
Great, thanks very much, Mark. So, that's a sort of fairly cautious note to end on. So I will now invite Kevin Pollpeter, the research scientist at the Center for Autonomy in the China Studies Division in Washington, DC, and a PhD candidate, Defense Studies at King's. Kevin has worked closely with Mark in the Space Security Research Group. Kevin.
Thanks, Kerry, and thanks, Mark. As Kerry mentioned, I'm from the Center for Naval Analyses, and I'm going to give just a brief overview of our report that we came out with late last year called China Space Narrative, which is available on our website, but it's also available on the U.S. Air Force's China Aerospace Studies website, and we did the study for them. And we look broadly at what Mark talked about is sort of U.S.-China competition in space. And I've been looking at China's space program for going on 20 years now, and it's really quite remarkable the transformation that China's space program has undergone in those 20 years. China has gone from a laggard in space to now being one of the global leaders in space. Last year, they conducted 35 successful launches, one of the most of all the space powers. This year, they're planning to conduct 40 launches. So again, a robust launch schedule. And if you have a robust launch schedule, of course, you're going to be launching a lot more satellites. China now has 412 satellites in orbit. That's the second most of any country behind the US. They have just about every type of satellite a country could want at this point. And as Mark mentioned, they have a lunar exploration program. They've recently sent an orbiter to Mars. They're going to start building their longer-term space station this year. So China is really just hitting on all cylinders here in the past few years. It's been really quite amazing. China now considers itself the third leading space power behind the United States and Russia. But as Mark stated, they do have ambitions to become the leading space power by 2045. So what's driving this? And this is really what our report is about. And really the primary motivation as we see it is there's a military rationale for developing China's space program. Long gone are the days where China used to rely on a people's war sort of strategy where he had mass human wave attacks like they did in the Korean War. China now is really focused on developing a modern military that uses information, that both collects information and denies information to an adversary. And really where they get this from is the 1991 Gulf War, where China realized that to fight a modern war, you need space capabilities. You need the ISR, the remote sensing, you need the satellite navigation, you need the communications infrastructure. And when China looks at the US, they see that, they surmise, they assess that the US military uses space for 80% of its communications and about 70 to 90% of its intelligence gathering. And so when they're looking at the US, they say, hey, we want some of that, okay? To be a modern military, to be able to project power out beyond China's shores, you need space. But of course, then they also see that space is a great vulnerability for the United States, that the US has become so dependent on space that if you were to knock that out, you could really debilitate the US military. And so what we have seen, and Mark has mentioned this, and I think maybe Victoria will talk to it a little bit more, is we've seen a lot of counter space testing and testing related to counter space. Everything from, as Mark mentioned, direct descent kinetic kill vehicles. We've seen cyber attacks against US and other international space related organizations. We've had co-orbital testing where one satellite against another. We've had directed energy tests. So really quite a broad-based counter space program that I personally think is designed to threaten the US from the ground all the way up to geosynchronous orbit, all the way up to 36,000 kilometers. This is meant to threaten the entire US space enterprise. Okay, so a lot to worry about there, as Mark stated, on the military side for the US. A second driver is economics, and generally, Chinese see space technology as a strategic technology that can help generate economic growth across the broader Chinese economy. And in our report, we focus on the use of commercial space, which is now very popular, especially with the rise of companies like SpaceX. China now has about 160 commercial space companies. And it's important to note here that commercial does not necessarily mean private. Some of these so-called commercial companies are actually subsidiaries of state-owned industries. Some of them are funded by governments. But the idea here is that China wants to get more into a commercial market, not just manufacturing satellites and launchers for government clients, but for private clients. And here really, again, they're looking at what the US has been doing in space with this commercial space program. And they want to sort of leverage the synergies, the dynamism of the private sector and bring that technological innovation to their own space program. What's interesting, I think, is that, there are legitimate concerns that China will use a mercantilist approach to support its private space program, where it will provide subsidies and other types of benefits to its commercial space program to outcompete other international companies. But what's interesting, what we found in our study, is that actually there's a great chagrin amongst those in China's private space industry that the Chinese government is not doing enough to support private space industry, that in actuality, they should be learning more from the US about how the US has supported its own commercial space industry, whether that's reserving contracts for private companies or just generally promoting development. But certainly, the mercantilist threat is present. China now, for example, has 20 commercial space launch companies, probably way more than what the international market can support. So this is watch this space. This is a developing area of competition. The third driver then is diplomatic. And China is becoming more active in using space for diplomatic purposes. And what we see at the broad strategic level, China is a main diplomatic theme is that it wants to build a community of common destiny of humankind. It's presenting itself as the kinder, gentler superpower. It is not the United States. It works through the UN. It will It does not rely on the use of force like the US does. And it's all inclusive. It will work with anybody regardless of political system or level of development. And when we're seeing that theme play out in its space program, China wants to build a community of common destiny in space, where it says that it is open to cooperation with all countries, again, regardless of political system or level of development. And the idea here is that they will take what they want to do is they want to be able to take the lead internationally, generally internationally, but also in space. And we see that they want to work through the UN. So they prioritize all cooperation through the UN. And we see this happening most prominently here with China's space station, where they opened up cooperation, international cooperation to China's space station, which they say is unlike how the US operates the International Space Station, which is really closed off to the original International Space Station partners. And so they've opened that up to international cooperation. And so the challenge here for the United States then is that China is positioning itself to be a leader in space. As its capabilities grow, it will naturally have more to contribute to international space cooperation. And I think we've seen that here in just the past 24 hours now, where China and Russia have announced that they are going to cooperate on a joint lunar base. It's unclear now what that is, whether that's actually a base on the moon or orbiting the moon. But it'll be situations like this which will continue to challenge the US diplomatically to remain that space superpower. So what we conclude in our report is that the dynamic between the United States and China in space actually reflects the overall strategic competition that characterizes their relationship. And as China's space program challenges US's leadership in space, it challenges it just like it challenges the US across the totality of diplomatic, military, and economic power. So this, this creates some great challenges for the US as China's general rise creates challenges for the US. And I'll hand it back to you, Kerry. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Kevin. So now we have the second speaker on the panel, Professor Astrid Nordin, the Professor of World Politics and the Founding Director of Lancaster University China Centre, University of Lancaster. Astrid.
Thank you very much, Kerry, and thanks to Mark and Kevin. And Kevin's talk gave a really nice segue into the comments that I wanted to make about exactly that broader context in which this narrative about China in space sits. So we've seen Chinese sources, and we see this both in the paper that Kevin refers to and in Mark's policy report here, that Chinese sources depict an aspiration to do two key things. The first one is to eclipse US power in space as elsewhere. And the second one is to depict China as this better, more harmonious, more civilized leader of an alternative world order and space order with China at its head. So through both these key parts of the narrative, we see the Chinese state positioning itself as the superior party in a number of hierarchical relationships. And there are two key audiences that I want to discuss as the other part in the relationships at hand. The first one is domestic Chinese audience, right? So a lot of this narrative comes out of Chinese language sources. It's not produced primarily for consumption by an international audience, but by Chinese people at home. And the key thing that I think the Chinese state wants to manufacture in that relationship is consent to one party rule, even happiness with one party rule. So they're saying to this domestic audience, look, we're the good guys here. We're the ones who go out in space in order to share and invite everybody in and work with everybody who wants to, regardless of what their ideology is or their level of development is. Everybody gets to be part of our gang, right? Now, we might be the leaders of that gang, but everybody gets to come in here. And so you should be happy about CCP rule because you're ruled by the good guys. right? That are contributing in a positive way in the world. And also we're doing this through doing the kind of things that great powers do, right? We've had an Olympics, we've had a World Fair. We are now doing all these things in space that only really great powers do, especially with a kind of Cold War as a reference point. So they're saying to the Chinese domestic population, aren't you guys lucky to have us as your leaders? And if you only go along with this and continue to cooperate with us and behave in an equally harmonious way, accept your position in society, don't stir up fuss and cause trouble that will derail this progress to global preeminence, then you will be able to be so proud of being Chinese, be part of this great nation that is doing great things in space, and they're doing it better than the Americans, right? And so you can be proud and patriotic and loyal, right? So this is the message that's being told to a domestic Chinese audience through these narratives. And then I think a kind of secondary audience of this community of common destiny idea that Kevin referred to. It's a slightly tweaked narrative for an international audience. And here I think China is also positioned as the better alternative to the US and the West, including in world order more broadly and in the space order as part of that broader narrative. And I think it's important to remember that that international audience that's the target of that narrative is not necessarily Western, right? It's not necessarily speaking to people sitting in the UK or in the US, but to people in a lot of other parts of the world. So they too are being told, look, working with us is going to be a lot easier than working with those Americans who aren't letting you onto their space station. We're going to let you onto ours, right? And there's an effort there to say, look, we're going to be harmonious and nice and inclusive in this cooperation in space, just like we're being in the UN, in the Belt and Road Initiative, in other Chinese government initiatives abroad. Now, of course, that narrative isn't accepted by everybody. There are those who have experienced Chinese inclusive initiatives in other parts of world politics and have found them all that inclusive all of the time, and that have found that, well, even in a win-win situation, somebody might win more than others, and so that might cause asymmetries. And I think that maybe, Kerry, you wanted us to say a little bit about then, well, what's the upshot of this? What does good policy look like in that kind of context? And I think that there are a number of options, but certainly a response consisting of a punitive, belligerent clampdown on challenges by the US or by other Western powers will confirm the Chinese narratives, right? So a belligerent response shows that the Chinese narrative is correct, right? That the US is indeed the baddie on the block, that responds belligerently to challenges, that isn't confident in its own system, and that therefore needs to use violence and force and threats in order to maintain its superiority. And that seems to tell us, well, maybe the Chinese are right then. An alternative would be to maybe take a cue from some of my Chinese colleagues to say that we should learn from traditional Chinese ways of thinking that take an inspiration, that argue that supremacy is earned by self-rectification and by leading by example. And so perhaps part of a US response, Western response more broadly, potentially, is to say, well, okay, let's show everybody that we're really worthwhile to collaborate with, not just if you're a potentially threatening superpower, but for others too, others who might be won over by the Chinese narrative and who might see that there's more for them in working with China in space, well, let's make sure that they see what's on the table for them, what might be attractive about our systems, our way of doing things, and collaboration and cooperation with Americans in and around space. So that's my gambit, that's my invitation for a comment from my co-panelists. And with that, I think I hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you, Astrid. So we will come back to that suggestion in a second, a bit later. But now the final panelist, Victoria Samson, the director of the Secure World Foundation, Washington, DC. The Secure World Foundation works to promote cooperation, cooperative solutions for space sustainability. Victoria.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's been fascinating hearing these insights and reading Mark's paper. I'm looking forward to the conversation later on. As was stated, my name is Victoria Samson. I'm the Washington Office Director of the Secure World Foundation. What I'll be talking about for the next few minutes is every year we put out a counterspace threat assessment, where we look at counterspace capabilities of selected countries, United States, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, India, Japan, and France, and talk about what we know from an unclassified perspective, and more importantly, what we don't know. Part of the reason why we wanted to put together this counterspace threat assessment is that particularly in the West, oftentimes news stories about counterspace potential capabilities by, let's face it, China, often get either very quickly classified, so you really can't talk very thoroughly about what's going on, or they're almost hyperbolically hyped, and, into a boogeyman, so to speak. So we wanted to put down, okay, what do we actually know to be able to, have a more holistic contextual conversation. So this document is available on our website if you'd like to read more. It's 150 pages, so I'm not going to go into all of it. But really quickly, just to talk about it, there's strong evidence that China has sustained an effort to develop a broad range of counterspace capabilities. It has conducted multiple tests of technologies for rendezvous and proximity operations, RPO, in both low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit that could lead to a co-orbital anti-satellite capability. However, as of yet, the public evidence indicates that they have not conducted an actual destructive co-orbital intercept of a target. And there is no public proof that these technologies are being developed for counterspace, as opposed to intelligence gathering or other purposes. China has had at least one, and possibly as many as 3 programs underway to develop direct ascent anti-satellite capabilities, either as dedicated counterspace systems or as mid-course missile defense systems that could provide counterspace capabilities. China has engaged in multiple progressive tests of these capabilities since 2005, indicating a serious and sustained organizational effort. Chinese direct ascent ASAT capability against low Earth orbit targets. Low Earth orbit in this case is anything from about 160 kilometers to 2,000 kilometers, is likely mature and likely to be operationally fielded on mobile launchers. Chinese direct ascent capability against deep space targets, both in medium Earth orbit, which usually is anywhere between 12,000 and 20,000 kilometers, and geostationary orbit, which is at 36,000 kilometers, is likely still in the experimental or developmental phase. And there is not sufficient evidence to conclude whether there is an intent to develop it as an operational capability in the future. Although official Chinese statements on space warfare and weapons have remained consistently aligned to the peaceful uses of outer space, privately they've become more nuanced. China has recently designated space as a military domain, and military writings state that the goal of space warfare and operations is to achieve space superiority using offensive and defensive means in connection with their broader strategic focus on asymmetric cost imposition, access denial, and information dominance. In 2015, China reorganized its space and counterspace forces as part of a larger military reorganization and placed them in a new major force structure that also has control over electronic warfare and cyber. That said, it is uncertain whether China would fully utilize its offensive counterspace capabilities in a future conflict, or whether the goal is to use them as a deterrent against US aggression. And there is no public evidence of China actively using counterspace capabilities in current military operations. So in a nutshell, I know we're running out of time. I'll stop there. But I will say, just for the US, China is complicated, not just in space, but especially in space. And oftentimes we've taken steps that create a situation we actually didn't want to have happen in the first place. So I look forward to the conversation with my panelists. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. If I could invite attendees, listeners, to put any questions they have in the Q&A boxes, that would be very helpful. So we do have one question, and I think someone's already alluded to it, the China-Russia Lunar Space Station. How do you think this kind of changes the situation, or you know, kind of proves maybe points you've already established? Mark, what's your view on this?
I mean, in and of itself, it might not be a threat, but I suppose what's interesting is that it's certainly, you know, signs of an alliance. I suppose when we look at Western states, one thing that we all enjoy, we think of the Five Eyes, we think of NATO, these states, you know, we have leverage in terms of alliance structures. That's something that China doesn't have, and of course it's trying to do via things like the Belt and Road. It has an unusual relationship with Russia. I don't really know, you know, to the extent or how to characterize it, but certainly that sees some cooperative ventures in space that could portend other things. And I guess that's where it's most interesting. Maybe less about the specifics and more about the potential, but keen to hear others on that one.
Yeah, Kevin, what do you think of this?
Yeah, I think Mark's right. I think the main implications are really strategic, and that, you know, China and Soviet Union and now Russia have had a troubled relationship, right? You know, beginning in the 50s and going all the way up until now. The Soviet Union actually supplied ballistic missiles to China for China to reverse engineer in their ballistic missile program. That was cut off in 1958. They went into sort of their own little Cold War, and it's been on again, off again. But I think with Putin in power in Russia and Xi Jinping in power in China, there's been a move to more actively counter the U.S. And here's where the strategic angle comes in. And I think that, you know, that this is indicative of a growing relationship between China and Russia. We've seen it now in space with this lunar exploration program. They've talked about cooperation on ballistic missile defense. But then broadly, you know, we've seen China and Russia even participating in joint exercises and war games. So I think the bigger message here is that Russia and China appear to be coming together strategically, and this is how it's playing out in space.
Great. And maybe Victoria, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, what we're doing, what's happening on the moon is indicative of how our use of space is evolving. The United States has promoted its Artemis Accords. These are a series of principles, guidances, and best practices to do further exploration in space in a cooperative, sustainable manner. And a lot of them are based on the Outer Space Treaty principles. China has not signed on to that. Russia has not signed on to it. They've both been very suspicious. Right now, there's only 9 countries that have agreed to go forward with it. It just got released last fall, so it's still very early. But for me, it's very interesting to see, you know, is this an effort to produce a counter to the Artemis Accords, which, you know, maybe I'm biased because I'm American, but the Artemis Accords, I think, are potentially very productive in terms of ensuring that the next use of space is being done in a cooperative manner. And if we start to have competing versions of what that means, you know, this could be very, it could be destabilizing.
Great, and I think this is a question really for Astrid. What would you suggest to the states that are sitting on the fence, the ones that have not chosen sides between China, Russia, and the United States, and the ones that believe that none of these countries pose a solution to the problems at hand? So, where would you go, Astrid, if you were in that position?
Gosh, it's a tricky question. I would perhaps encourage them to not rush into taking sides. I think sides taking might aggravate this problem that we're kind of seeing of an emerging kind of China versus the West type narrative that I think in the end serves neither particularly well. And I think a lot of countries, I think, will find a great temptation to pick sides, because there are a lot of rewards involved in picking sides, right? But ultimately, in the kind of longer run, I think most countries, and of course this will depend on their own positioning and who in these countries we're talking about, right? Because they're not unitary actors in that kind of way, will maintain better relationships ultimately by not throwing their weight in with either one side or the other, but rather resisting this idea of two poles and a clash or a fight between, you know, one goodie and a baddie, but to perhaps have a more
kind of, we were booted out because apparently there's only one account, and if people go into a meeting, then it kicks everyone else out, which I wasn't aware of. So I do apologize for that. I think now let me just see if because there was a very important question from Leonie. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, Kerry,
Right.
can I just chime in on what Astrid was saying?
Yes,
What we're hearing from countries, especially in Southeast Asia, is that they don't want to choose. They don't want to get drawn into a Cold War type conflict between China and the US, because one, they appreciate the economic benefits they get from their relationship with China, but then they also appreciate the security benefits as well as the economic benefits that they get from the US. So what you're hearing out, you know, especially in Asia, is that, you know, they don't want to choose. And so somehow if the US can portray itself as not forcing a decision onto countries, I think that would probably be the best approach.
Right.
And if I may add one other thing to that, Kerry, I mean, the one thing I try to emphasize when I talk about China's space program and, you know, international cooperation thereof, it's not a zero-sum game. It truly is not. China's emphasis and investment in their space program is not being done directly detracting away from the US and its allies' capabilities. In my opinion, the more countries that invest in their space capabilities, the more countries that invest in space infrastructure, the more of an incentive they have to make sure that domain is predictable, reliable, and accessible to all over the long term. They're putting skin in the game. So I don't necessarily see it as immediately a threat. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So there's a question here from my colleague, Leonie Zeno. China's plans for outer space seem to confirm that China in general has a very ambitious grand strategic agenda, and it tends to plan very long term. Yet its military doctrine appears to be more realistic and cautious. It's as if the grand strategic, it's as if at the grand strategic level, we can see Xi Jinping's imprint, but from a military doctrine perspective, China has not yet moved fully beyond the sort of previous leader Deng Xiaoping's, you know, famous hide your strength and bide your time approach. So kind of cautiousness combined with maybe a kind of more assertive posture. So we seem to see two different Chinas. So does this sort of does this also kind of feed into, you know, the kind of China in space? I mean, is it that we see a sort of combination of cautiousness on the one hand, but also a kind of willingness to be bolder in some areas? Or is it thus that, you know, kind of the sort of outer space is a place where China can be much bolder, and that's where everything else is going to eventually catch up with? Maybe Mark, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think we've seen there is a fairly large sea change in China's military doctrine, you know, around the year 2000, I suppose, where we see China going from a defensive posture to one that incorporates a certain level of offensive thinking as well. So it seems to me that they have incorporated space technology, space capabilities in their military postures. So I would say that they are moving forward in that respect. I'm not so sure that they're really hiding their times. I mean, and the kind of rhetoric coming out of the official press is quite almost jingoistic when it comes to both military capabilities and space. So I'm not so sure that they are hiding that capability. I mean, Kevin, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess I would have to agree. I would say that as China's military power has grown, it has been more has been more assertive in using that military power. Now, have we seen them conducting military operations like the U.S.? No, but certainly you can see that in their efforts in the South China Sea and building artificial islands in the South China Sea. You can see it in their military coercion tactics against Taiwan that are happening quite frequently now, with circumnavigation of Taiwan with bombers or Chinese fighter planes crossing the center line in the cross strait center line. We've seen China establish its first naval support base in Djibouti. So in actual, I would say what we're seeing, at least on this side of the pond, is actually China is becoming even more aggressive militarily now. Has that resulted in them dropping bombs? Absolutely not. But it's certainly one factor that one element of their national power that they are using. And so I would say then that then translates into China's space program. As I stated in my remarks, I think the number one reason for China to develop its space program right now is for national security reasons. And they see this as they want to be able to protect their own interest, and space plays a vital part in achieving their sort of their pursuit of terrestrial national interest.
There is, I mean, I kind of wonder, so it's kind of ambiguous from what Victoria was saying, kind of China in space, when it's quite a new thing. It could be doing it for status reasons, it could be doing it for research reasons, it could be doing it for hybrid reasons. I mean, are we seeing kind of China that we want to see? Or are we seeing the China that's real? Because I mean, there's a lot of vested interest in America and Europe in China turning out to be the enemy we've always wanted. I mean, I think that's sort of like, we know the good money is on that. I mean, and I don't know. I mean, because I suppose from what Victoria said, it's all a bit ambiguous, and it could, I mean, in a court of law, you're kind of innocent until you're guilty, right? so at what point do we sort of nab the Chinese and say, this is definitely hostile intent? I mean, are you not worried that there's been a lot of kind of investment into this narrative of China being the big threat, and that therefore this is just sort of why we might see the problems we do see in this area rather than actually existing?
I think we have to be very cautious about that. And I think, the way you're right, perhaps sometimes we do portray things in a much more binary fashion that we ought to. The way we need to move ahead, and as I say, probably people are interested in thinking about that, I think must be with a high degree of engagement with China, so that we can get a better understanding. I mean, I've often thought in the past, looking at China's space program, we don't understand China enough. But it's slightly concerning, as I say, Kevin's paper comes out and it seems to reveal a great competitive element. Now, it doesn't, as you say, it doesn't make them a bogeyman, and some of these things Western states have done in the past, anti-satellite testing, et cetera, and space debris. In the current environment, I suppose it does seem to be the one that's pushing the boundaries to a certain extent. They say the 2007 test wasn't something that they even acknowledged until pressed, and similar with the 2013 supposed test. But you're right, we don't know for sure what that was, but there's a fair degree of supposition about what it might be. So, and I just mentioned, we have our alliance structures, and as I say, that we derive a great benefit from that. But of course, you don't want to appear too much that you're ganging up on a particular state. I mean, you can then create the dynamics that it paints them into a corner, effectively. And I think Victoria might have said something similar earlier. But so you have to be quite cautious, I think.
Well, there's a practical question. Sorry, Victoria. Yeah.
Sorry. I just want to add in, I mean, what China is doing in space is not very different from what the United States does in space, or what even Russia is doing. And that was part of the reason why we wanted to put together our counter space threat document, because these activities, space is a vacuum, these activities are not happening in a political vacuum. And so absolutely one does feed into and I guess encourage the other. It is also affected by statements done here in the United States that are given cover for other countries to do things maybe they wanted to do anyways, but now they can say, well, we're doing a response to the United States. So you have to be very careful about that. And again, I say this, understanding China and transparency do not go well together. Like there are obviously things they could be doing. There's this idea of, sharing intent. That would be extremely helpful. Having an idea of being able to verify activities on orbit, getting better space situation awareness, that absolutely helps everything. But again, just, putting in the context, it's not happening. They're not doing this by themselves.
So there's a practical question that someone's asked, and James Henderson has asked, what should the US do to stay ahead of China in space technology? I presume spend an enormous amount of money, which might be the point, I guess, but anything else that the United States can do? Maybe Kevin, what should the United States do to stay ahead?
Yeah, I think we should leverage continue what we're doing, leverage our private commercial industry to achieve those, to achieve that innovation. There's lots of talk about, at least here in the US, about how do we restrict China's access to technologies? How do we, block them out of the US market? Ultimately, that's a defensive game, and we will never win using defensive tactics. We need to be proactive in the way that we approach technology development in space and across the board. And unfortunately, what we've seen in US R&D is that there's been a tendency to emphasize commercial R&D over government R&D, and that's fine. We benefited from the innovation coming out of Silicon Valley. But what we often forget is a lot of those innovations in Silicon Valley were based on advancements made from Defense Department research back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so I think what we need to do here in the US is really sort of harken back to how we used to conduct R&D in the past, about how the US government would do more basic R&D and then have our own military civil fusion program like the Chinese, right? And then use those spin-off technologies to promote commercial endeavors. And we've seen to have forgotten how to do that in the past few decades.
Then another question from Lincoln Hines is, firstly, so Mark would probably know the answer to this, which of China's space projects consume the greatest portion of its space spending? And the second, which anyone could answer, who's willing to, is what are the main technical challenges for China's counter space program in negating American military space power in the event of a localized conflict? So, Mark, what is China spending the most money on at the moment?
Well, I think that's a tough one because their budgets are always a bit obscure. So I think actually finding out what's consuming the most, you have to make estimates on a number of these things. Things like, if we think about the economic value, things like launch is expensive and you don't necessarily get much of a return. So we might argue that absorbs quite a lot of cost without much return. I would imagine things like its Mars missions, and some of those are probably pretty costly as well. But I've not looked into the budget, I must say, but I think, it always seems to me it's pretty speculative when you're looking internally. The numbers for the space budget more generally is much, much smaller than that of the US, but what that really equates to in, man hours, et cetera, is much harder to make an equation as well. So I don't have a very good answer. It was a bit of bluff. Kevin might know much better.
Yeah. Mark is exactly right. Budgeting in China is very hard to do. And back of the envelope sort of cost estimates come in around $6 to $8 billion a year for China, and that was a few years ago. So pretty much, and even if you were to increase that by a bit, NASA's budget is what, 19 billion, 20 billion. So it is still just a portion of what the U.S. spends overall on space. As far as priorities, there was an interesting document that came out a few years ago that listed the priorities, and the top priorities were for what we would call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, remote sensing satellites, communication satellites, satellite navigation, those sorts of capabilities. At the second tier then were things like human space flight, the space station, lunar exploration, that sort of thing. And then at the bottom tier were more scientific oriented programs that were just that did not involve human exploration, but we're still looking at space science. So there you get a ranking and you get a sense of what their priorities are in space. But again, space budget, it's difficult to pin down.
And just quickly, the technical challenges for China's counter space program in negating American military space. So what are the technical challenges that China's facing in trying to negate America?
Well, again, Kevin probably has a lot of granularity on this particular one, but I think part of the elements I mentioned were looking at both the physical kinetic weapons, but also what we might call those sub-threshold activities, which is much easier to achieve. It doesn't mean it's simple to achieve. And of course, we have ways of knowing if our GPS signals are being manipulated, etc. So those are some of the low-hanging fruit in some respects. I think we'll see America changing, the sense of, instead of deterrence, we're looking more at resilience increasingly. And that will be much harder if we're thinking of kinetic physical weapons that, you just can't take out a constellation very easily. But a big technical challenge for anybody in space in that environment is, of course, if you do take those kind of steps, there's the distinct possibility of fratricide. You create so much debris. So it always seems to me that, a possibility here is China becomes more reliant on space. It's going to have to think about restraint as well, because the more you have, the less you want to see things flying around in space. So that creates its own dichotomy. So it might be more of a political challenge rather than a technical one. I don't know if Kevin, Victoria, or you guys want to come in?
So maybe the final question, so if you wrap everything up into this final question, because it's a big question. So I'll take maybe the panel in reverse order this time, from Victoria, and then Astrid, then Kevin, and then Mark. So, okay, we have the problem. So what is the solution to organizing space? The question is, from, I think, Joel Postma, the potential of international legal initiatives such as the Woomera Manual or the draft EU Code of Conduct for creating viable international legal frameworks that may mitigate some of the escalation potential in the growing competition in the space domain. So would a space kind of, sort of convention be a solution? Is that viable? Victoria?
No, thank you. No, next panelist. No, really quickly, no, because the time for treaties for space, really the last one that was done, and effectively, it was in the mid-1970s. It's not really an effective way of handling this type of threat. Because what treaties do is they tend to limit, technologies, essentially. They focus on, if you don't like something, you ban it or you prevent it being proliferated. Whereas for space, it's so inherently dual use, really what you need to do is look at behavior, actions. And that's why the UK resolution that has been mentioned several times, where countries are asked to report to the UN Secretary General, what do they identify as the biggest threats? What do they see as responsible behavior, and would look for the way forward? That's really a positive look, because currently the multilateral mechanisms that have been dealing with space security have been going round and round in circles for decades now. Treaty, no treaty, treaty, no treaty. And then we haven't gone anywhere. And so this is a way to hop off that path and try and establish a new mechanism that could actually be effective. And again, non-legally binding can be, it can be very positive steps. So I'm very optimistic about this move. I'm looking forward to seeing how the resolution plays out. Thank you.
Right. Astrid?
No. I agree with Victoria. I don't think that a legal framework is going to solve any of the problems at hand. I think if we look to both the US and China, they have been remarkably good at creating loopholes for themselves when it comes to legal frameworks, at finding explanations for why what they're doing is not contravening a given piece of legislation by often just renaming things in a different way. So I don't really think that those legal frameworks are going to really help the situation, especially if push comes to shove. So I think that the way forward in a context where legal means are not going to resolve the situation for us, I think has to knuckle down and work on relationships perhaps we've overemphasized intent a little bit in this discussion, because I think intent changes over time and with different leaderships. So if we're setting up infrastructures and technologies that enable certain things to happen, those things might happen in future, whether or not the intent now is to use them for purpose X, Y, or Z. So I think an ongoing effort at negotiating relationships and dare I say it, build trust to the extent that that's possible, I think might be a more viable path than setting up legal frameworks that are then disregarded.
Thank you, Astrid. And then Kevin.
Yeah, let me add even more pessimism to this discussion. I think on a couple of levels, I don't see any international agreement happening anytime soon. I think the level of distrust right now between the U.S. and China is just going to be really difficult to overcome. Both countries have fundamental interests that they are pursuing, and sometimes those interests are in opposition to each other. And it's hard to see how as Victoria has stated, putting limits on the pursuit of those interests right now will be viewed as productive by either country. I would also say that the nature of space actually makes it more difficult to come up with a treaty about, as Victoria mentioned, what a space weapon to somebody is a dual use technology to somebody else. During the good old days of the Cold War, right? The Soviets wanted to ban the space shuttle because it had a robotic arm on it, and they thought we could take one of their satellites and put it into the bay of the space shuttle, sort of a la James Bond, and carry it back to the U.S. So there's some uniqueness there to the space and environment. So I also think that maybe is it too soon for some sort of treaty, because we just haven't, even though we've been active in space for decades, we are really just starting to begin to fully use space, and maybe we need to actually learn how to use space before we can figure out how to come up with treaties to govern activities there.
Thank you. And Mark, for the concluding words.
Thank you. Well, yes to all of the above. I mean, I think, just as we've heard, that I think the political mood at the moment makes it very unlikely. And we're also seeing new technologies, which, they need to evolve probably. So things like the Outer Space Treaty, I think, we're almost designed to be slightly fuzzy in the sense that the architects knew that they didn't know a number of things. We are finding things like, asteroid mining and many other things need probably to reach a certain level of maturity before we move much further. And otherwise we risk, I think, as Victoria said, limiting, technological progress and activity. Probably where we can, some of the short-term things, I think the UK's resolution, very positive. Maybe greater space situational awareness from a number of different quarters is a good one. It can increase, I think, legitimacy. So as more states can see things happening, and ideally characterize things happening, that could be beneficial. And this is maybe somewhere where the UK might jump in the future. But really, the discussions, I cut my teeth. My interest in space started when I was working at the UN and listened to some of these discussions in the conference on disarmament. And those debates about what is a weapon, they just go round and round in circles. And given the dual use technology, et cetera, that we've discussed today, it makes it extremely hard to see how you're going to limit those in an effective way, because there's a lot to gain from space. We have to be very cautious that we don't cut off our noses to spite our faces in that respect. So yes, unfortunately, a bit pessimistic, and we didn't see the EU Code of Conduct go very far. And but I'm hopeful at some stage that we will be able to. And I think engagement, the particular subject here, China engagement, is necessary before we can move forward. That's a little way off, but it's not impossible.
Thank you. So a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, a little bit of light at the end of the space shuttle, or whatever you want to whatever metaphor you want to use. Thank you very much, everyone. I do apologize for the hiccup halfway through. When this is edited and put online, I know that will all look very seamless. So hopefully that can then be sent to those attendees who weren't able to rejoin us. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to Mark for taking the initiative in producing this paper. It's now online for anyone to look at. It's an important debate, and this is an important contribution. I'm very grateful to everyone here today, to Victoria, Astrid, Kevin and Mark, and you know, really kind of important area. I'm sure we'll be coming back to discuss this sometime soon. Thank you very much.